start with Mr. Siraj Hussain. My question to you is, given our agrarian structure and organizational nature of agricultural markets, so I want your sort of first take on this. How do you view these 2.5 or 3 acts in terms of their sort of likely strengths and scope for bringing about whatever informally we were talking about, either transformational change or something else? Please. Yeah.
Thank you, Pal Singh. I think the general consensus over the years among the economists, the administrators, agricultural researchers, and the state governments was that the APMC system needs a rethink, and there is a need for bringing more competition, because in many cases we had found that APMCs were rather restrictive in providing competition, bringing competition so that the farmer could realize a better price. Having said this, one must acknowledge that in different states, the APMCs were at different levels of efficiency. So in some states, they function very well. The best functioning was in Punjab and Haryana, but also they functioned reasonably well in Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, and Rajasthan, to a large extent in Maharashtra, but in some states they were absent. So Bihar, of course, had abolished it, but even in West Bengal, Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, APMCs were very weak. So obviously the impact or the perceived impact of the APMCs had to be different, and it was always acknowledged that agriculture is a state subject. In fact, Dr. Sukhpal Singh knows it very well that till recently, the debate in the government and outside was whether agriculture trade should be brought to the concurrent list by way of a constitutional amendment. So it was never really thought that the center will be able to legislate without much of a challenge, legislate on the agricultural trade. But of course now everybody has it as a fait accompli. So I think the general direction everybody agreed is correct. However, the speed with which the reforms have come and whether entire country has to be treated similarly placed and similarly prepared for the reforms is a question which is now being answered through the protests, which means that it is difficult to have one law implemented across India at the same pace. Now, what has happened is that this question has got mixed up with the general agrarian problem relating to the marketing. So what has happened is that the farmers are at the mercy of the market, and there is huge volatility of prices. Now, due to this volatility, the farmers are very scared, especially in the states where they were able to sell their crop at MSP. So this issue has got mixed with the marketing reforms. Now, there is a view that market reforms will bring stability to the marketing arrangements, and there is a view that they will be very harmful. So I think I'll end here by saying that the general consensus is that the reforms were needed. However, the speed, the pace, and the way they were rushed through Parliament are issues which, on which there is no consensus.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this opening remarks. Now may I come to Dr. Sudha Narayanan and request her to examine for us the major weaknesses of the 3 acts, especially the 2 major ones which are about primarily about agriculture and agricultural markets. That is what we call APMC Mandi Bypass Act and the Contract Farming Act, and their implications from the perspective of India's vast majority of small producers, including tenants and other small-time workers in the sector? Dr. Narayanan.
I think I've had a lot of opportunity to discuss the details of the acts. I'll confine myself here to specific aspects that I think that concern me more than others. The general thrust of this act, the APMC bypass, all of it is from the perspective of supply chain actors or buyers. They're not really designed from the perspective of the sellers. So if I'm a small producer, historically, irrespective of what the APMC Acts already said, I was free to seek my own buyer. So to give you an example, in Karnataka, there's a turmeric growing region in Chamarajnagar, and there actually people from Erode in Tamil Nadu, traders used to come, give inputs and procure from the farm gate turmeric to take back to the Erode Mandi. So there, irrespective, and this has been going on for years, and even after reform of the Karnataka Act, it continued. This is to say that small producers always had that option, even though they were not particularly good options, to seek their own buyer. And in this bypass Mandi Act doesn't really change anything for them. They are still going to try and seek the best buyer. But it's kind of the way in which the narrative is structured is as if they were shackled so far and had no choice. And now suddenly they are free to choose. Ultimately, what matters is, are the supply chain actors or buyers going to approach the small farmers to procure from them? And there the evidence is very clear that there is a huge spatial inequality in where buyers go and what they produce, what they procure. So if you look at it, and research suggests that near high urban demand centers and where irrigation is available, even the smallest landholder will find multiple buyers. Whereas if you go to places which are rain-fed and maybe where urbanization is not very high, so it's quite far away from either roadways or cities, you won't have that many buyers. So in some sense, this act, to me, the biggest kind of blind spot in this act is it presumes that sellers will go everywhere evenly. And I think the distributional consequences of this act, we need to worry about marginal farmers in marginal settings. I don't think it's going to be a problem for people around, say, Bangalore or Mumbai or Pune, where historically a lot of private buyers have already come and purchased and things like that. Infrastructure will also go to these regions. So that's one point. The second issue is on the vulnerable sections. I think it can be defined in multiple ways, but tenant farmers, for example, or women farmers. In theory, again, you would think that freedom for women who typically can't go to their market to sell their own produce because of social norms or safety issues. These mandis are very gendered spaces. And you would think that this act actually facilitates their sale. But in fact, what you hear from organizations like Makam is that women producers actually value mandis as market spaces. Even if they don't go themselves, for them it's a reliable space where they can sell. And likewise for tenant farmers, I think that both for women and tenant farmers, the Contract Farming Act doesn't really make much of a difference. Because if you ask most agribusinesses that contract, if you go and ask any of them, how do you select your farmers? They'll say first they must have land. And that itself is a tripping point for most tenant farmers and women farmers. So any contract farming is typically done with the male member of the household who also has the name on the patta. So in some sense, it's not really particularly liberating for tenant farmers or women farmers that this act has come. And I'd like to finish with one last point, and this actually I'm referring to Professor Supal Singh's work on the labor conditions in many of these farms. I myself have done some work on labor involved in contracting farms and gherkins in Tamil Nadu, and where the burden on family labor was so high, and the women were working extraordinarily long hours at the time of harvest, so as to, because the gherkins changes size and grows very quickly, and the highest price is paid for the smallest gherkins, the burden on family labor, which is invisible, is quite high. So I think we also need to pay attention to, as these supply chains evolve, it may be profitable, but what are the trade-offs involved in terms of family labor of especially of women? So I'll stop there and come back to these issues.
Thank you. Now let me invite Dr. Vijay Lakshmi, because she comes from the place we keep talking during these discussions, and we need to hear from horse's mouth. The question for you, Dr. Vijay Lakshmi, is, given that Bihar had not just liberalized, but completely deregulated agriculture market, that means APMCs were abolished 14 years back, what is the experience you have had so far in the state in terms of farmer benefit, because most of Bihar's farmers are marginal or small, and the experience of receiving new investments in agribusiness and agricultural markets? Dr. Vijay Lakshmi.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this webinar today. As we all know that agriculture is a very, very complex subject. It's not just about, even if we put farmers first, put them in the focus, there are so many things for which farmers are dependent on to have a good produce and to get good price out of the produce and get a good livelihood opportunity out of this profession, vocation. So many factors are there, like seed, fertilizers, good monsoon, and good price, and good planning for the next crop, etc., etc. So there are so many things. Coming to in the context in which we are meeting, where there is so much of hullabaloo about the entire issue of introducing agri reforms. It's again, it's not a simple thing. There is no one size fits all solution, especially when it comes to agriculture sector. Very, very complicated sector. Too many players, too many stakeholders. So for each one, their own view suits them very well. So everybody has a view on this. Everyone thinks from their own perspective. Government thinks from their perspective, but government has to actually look after the poor and marginal farmers' interests, keep their interests at their core, at the heart, and then make a policy. So I'm sure government always has the best interests of farmers. But there are so many other stakeholders who are also at loggerheads and competing for the space, etc., etc. So coming to these three reform bills.
Dr. Vijay Lakshmi, please, we want you to tell us about the Bihar experience so far.
Yeah. Bihar is the first state in the country which has repealed this APMC Act way back in 2006. So after that, the experience has been mixed for me. And please don't take this as the government of Bihar's views. These are my own views. I'm speaking from my experience spending at least 6 years in agri and allied sector, and also as an enthusiast and a passionate person for agriculture sector. So if you actually see the Bihar scenario, agriculture scenario, you have almost 97% are marginal farmers. So for these farmers, it cuts both ways. In fact, I've been interacting with mandi people also. The mandis, even though the act has been repealed, the mandis are there. The mandis exist. The auction happens every day in the mandis. People go there, sell their produce there, they get their price and come back. But only thing what has happened was that earlier in before 2006 there was certain issue with regard to people putting barriers everywhere, not barriers, sorry, barricades everywhere and charging 1% extra levy from the farmers. So that was the reason which has actually provoked the government that time to repeal this. Because it was a huge thing for farmers that by the time they reach the mandi, they have already paid so much of money, crossing various barricades, etc., crossing various districts and reaching the mandi wherever they want to go. So this was the thing which had provoked the government to do this. So after that, Professor, I'm coming to
No,
that
who,
scenario.
who was putting these barriers? Who was putting barriers and charging this? State actors or non-state actors?
No, private people only, but it was through some tendering procedure. So the state government was also involved during that time.
Okay.
This was long time back. So that had actually hit the then chief minister. Of course, the chief minister is still the same. So in 2006, this was immediately after he came to power. It was immediately repealed and made it free for everybody. Wherever one wants to go and sell their produce, they are free to go and sell their produce. So this was the scenario. So after that, of course, it has created a lot of space for later on, like, the government has promoted farmer producer organizations. So FPOs slowly came up, even though they are not so many when compared to other developed states, but still there are FPOs in agri and allied sector. And they are actually running the show. So FPOs got some space here in this scenario. And since marginal and small farmers are there, so since as Sudha Narayan put it, I agree with her views that it doesn't actually make a lot of difference for them unless they are very much dependent on credit. So what happens is that in mandis, these traders, I spoke to a lot of traders also. So these people go to the mandis, sell their produce, take some credit from the mandi people, and then use that for the next sowing season and repay it, and they get interest free loans from the mandi people. So that way there is a link, there is a mutual relationship, cohabitation kind of a thing, symbiotic relationship which has been existing between traders and even small farmers. So
Okay.
this is one thing.
We'll
The
come back
other
to you
problem.
on more detail. We'll come back to you in second round. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Now, may I invite Professor Vikas Rawal? And the question I want you to address, Vikas, is that how far do you think these regulatory reforms, all three or at least the major two, which are about agri and agri markets, how far can they help us achieve more effective market access for majority of the farmers who are marginal or small? Can we make agri markets more inclusive with the help of these acts? Or it's the other way around?
Okay. Professor Singh, thank you for having me here. And thank you, Dr. Ghosh and Dr. Kumar Das. Let me just, take on from what previous speakers have said. While I agree with a lot of what has been said, I want to make one point. Mrs. Siraj Hussain was pointing out that how there was widespread understanding that the APMC system had its problems, and there was a consensus that this needed to be reformed. I think we should not overstate that case. There was a consensus that there were problems. I mean, I don't know if it's even correct to call it a consensus. There was widespread, view that there were problems with the APMC system, but I do not think there is a consensus on what kind of reforms were required. People had very different views about the problems and the kind of reforms that were required. And I'm glad Dr. Vijay Lakshmi has mentioned this, that, you can't have one straitjacket solution for problems of agriculture in the country. And that's the reason why fundamentally agriculture was always considered a state subject, which obviously is no more the case. That said, one important thing, one very basic thing, and rather important to understand is, the typology that Mr. Siraj Hussain said. There are some states where APMCs worked well, and there are some states where APMCs did not work well. The basic difference between these was there is one group of states where APMCs were established with a lot of investment. There were APMCs everywhere. The density of APMCs was high, and farmers had access to APMCs. The other group is states where APMCs were far and few, and a large number of farmers simply did not have access to APMCs. Talk of states, pre-2006 Bihar, talk of states like West Bengal, most farmers simply sell it to local traders. They don't have access to APMCs. So, to say that APMCs in those states do not work, well, yes, they do not work because they are not there. And where those APMCs are there, I mean, the level of infrastructure in those APMCs leaves much to desire. Now, what is the natural way forward in that situation? The natural way forward in that situation, one is to increase the investment, that to establish more mandis, and that was surely one thing that people had been asking for, the farmers had been asking for, and a lot of analysts, academics had written about it, how market infrastructure in a lot of states was weak and needed to be strengthened. Now, instead of doing that, you have a law which basically aims to bypass it. You see, now that I think is not really the direction in which you needed to go. I would like to, bring your attention to a rather important thing I found in the Standing Committee on Agriculture for Parliament, in the Lok Sabha Standing Committee on Agriculture, the 16th Lok Sabha, the last Lok Sabha.
2019 report, January 2019
Yes,
report. Yeah.
19 report specifically says that in Bihar, the marketing, and I'm quoting, in Bihar, the marketing and other ancillary infrastructure available in the mandis before the repeal of their APMC Act in 2006 has eroded with time. So, after the repeal, the infrastructure has further eroded. Now, if that's the direction in which, repeal of, or, bypassing of APMC Acts is going to take, I think there is a serious problem that, states which have weak infrastructure are states where this direction of change is likely to actually weaken the infrastructure, further reduce the access of farmers to decent marketing infrastructure. I am not convinced that this is a change that is going to bring about either. In fact, I am very circumspect that these laws by themselves are adequate even to mobilize large scale private investment, as has not happened in states like Bihar. States which don't have basic public investment in market infrastructure, in private investment in supply chain does not materialize. So,
Okay. Okay. I think.
so
Thank you.
that's one point. The
Yeah.
second is, I'm also not convinced that these laws by themselves would actually create greater competition. My feeling is that they would actually create greater monopoly powers. So on both these counts, mobilizing of greater investment and creating greater competition, I do not see that this is the right direction.
Thank you. Thank you. In fact, that's the question I now want to pose to Mr. Siraj Hussain. Now, if this is the stated objective of the government of India, we are hearing again and again that they wanted to get more private sector, corporate sector investment in agriculture, especially agricultural markets, to enhance farmer incomes. You think these acts can serve that purpose? And if not, what are the other enabling things government needs to do so that we get to benefit from this change and make it, as you said, transformative?
I think the states where the investment climate is good will be more attractive to the private sector for making investment in the supply chains. For example, in the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen more than 50 private mandis being set up in Maharashtra. So, since the investment climate there is considered to be much better, people were already going there. Now, in case of Bihar, I found as CMD of Food Corporation of India that under the Private Entrepreneurs Guarantee Scheme, where the government gives a guarantee for payment of rent for 10 years, we had to float tenders 7 times, 8 times, even 8 times, for a project in which return is guaranteed by the government, because the investment climate is poor and electricity is not there, rural roads are not very good, law and order is not as good as one would like. So what I want to say is that these laws alone do not bring investment, as we have seen poorer states. However, these laws do enable more investment in states where otherwise the investment climate is good. So, for example, after this amendment in the EC Act, I can see more investment coming in both perishable and non-perishable sector. Because of the uncertainty relating to EC Act, the corporates were very reluctant. And one good thing which has happened is the entry of e-commerce. So a lot of new players, startups are coming, which are trying to aggregate, link directly with the farmers. And if this differential in taxes continue between APMCs and outside, then I think many more startups will find their way. However, now the government of India has said that it will allow the state governments to treat the trade area at par with APMC. If that happens, then I think the state governments will have to substantially increase the number of licensee APMCs, because one of the problems with APMCs was that no new licenses were being issued. And in Delhi, we found that even SFAC was denied a license by Azadpur Mandi. So in both the situations, I think we will see private investment provided this issue is settled. However, I said it depends on a whole lot of other things.
Now, with this new channel being unleashed, Vikas, how do you think this will impact how do you think this will impact the smaller market entities like traders and local small processors who are intermediate kind of players in the value chains? How can they coexist with the corporates if corporate is going to come in a big way now? How do you see this coexistence or implication for the small? Yeah.
Processing, one will have to speculate, in this. I mean, it requires some speculation, so you'll have to pardon me for that. But I mean, I do think that this is going to start off a process of consolidation of market power, with a lot of these small players basically becoming agents of bigger traders. To some extent, they already are, but this would become more consolidated and thicker. With big agribusiness, the kind of example that Dr. Vijayalakshmi gave of Apple, a lot of traders, in fact, in case of Apple, it's already the case that these companies have their agents and so on. A lot of these traders act as their agents. This is something that would now could become much more pervasive and across many other commodities. That you would have these market agents who are smaller traders who are partly networked with each other, but partly also work independent of each other, now becoming a part of a much more thickly and more solidly organized chain of agents, which are eventually linked to larger agribusiness companies. So that's the direction I see this going, which clearly would be a process of capitalist differentiation. It will be a process in which larger traders would consolidate, the smaller traders would lose out. They will become agents, employees of these agribusiness in some cases, and franchisees in some cases. But eventually, I do see that you are likely to move into a situation where greater consolidation of market power will take place. That's probably the direction I see.
Okay, thank you. Sudha, one very important question to you, which is that if we have now these corporates as our real world as part of agricultural markets and our agricultural sector in terms of contract farming, how do you think we can leverage this for the benefit of small farmers and even landless workers, lazy farmers, like you talked about the workers' conditions? Is there any possibility of leveraging it in a positive manner and avoid the ill effects of what is coming in through these acts?
So I'm afraid here again, I'm kind of speculating. It's not coming out of concrete research that I've done. I think the way forward to me looks a little like slippery ground, and for the following reasons. I think what we have is a corporate world which is very differentiated itself. So as people have already said, There are new startups that are coming, many of them with the right intentions and social commitment. You have the old agribusinesses, and ITC comes to mind because they have deep investments. They've been in the sector for years, and they have developed farmer relationships for generations, and they are more invested and fixed in place so that they can, for example, their corporate social responsibility initiatives are in sustainable agriculture and water conservation because they know they are interacting with those farmers for the next 20 years. So that's the other group. The third group, I would call them more opportunistic, and I don't want to name specific companies. And I think there is a group that's not using agribusiness input markets or output markets as the space in which to do business, but their entry is going to come from data consolidation. So if you look at the investments people are making on big data, the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems actually has warned the EU that data is going to be the powerful new driver of consolidation, and that the EU should block mergers that lead to over-consolidation of farm data. And ominously, I think even though these acts say deregulation, I think that space is left open, and a lot of how we can leverage the corporate world depends on what regulatory frameworks occupy that space, how electronic trading is going to be regulated, how data consolidation is going to be managed. And there I'm very pessimistic, because if you look at the Doubling Farmers' Income report, there is a line that actually says that data is the way to go. And I'm quoting here, Aadhaar offers a unique platform to track the performance of these subsidies and a means to track doubling farmers' income in real time. So there's a way in which the vision of the Indian government seems to put together the idea of electronic platforms, private players, as well as data consolidation. And we know that many big companies that have entered or failed to enter the agriculture sector and do successfully there are now having Krishi apps and things like that to give farmer advisory and have this agri stacks and in a public-private partnership which will be monetized. So for me, this is the high-risk area where we probably don't know as much as the policymakers do, so I can only speculate. But I think that trend will lead to a consolidation of the agriculture sector, so that data consolidation becomes a pathway into agribusiness consolidation, where the control is quite implicit. And that can be put for smallholders in a very vulnerable position. How can we change this? We should never have had such over-centralization of the trade area. And I think that's what I'm seeing. On the one hand, it's deregulation, everyone can come in, but on the other hand, it's a potential centralization of regulation. And we know what is happening in other sectors. I don't have to go into that in detail here. But that over-centralization tendency, if it kicks in, then we can do very little to stop the big giants in agribusiness.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I have one more last question to the panelists, and any one of you can take a call on this. This is also an important part of the likely outcomes of these acts can lead us towards. This is about crop diversification and food security, two sides of the same coin. That would these regulatory reforms lead to crop diversification and therefore better farmer incomes, or would we also have other consequences, which is of issues of food security or food insecurity rather, because there'll be movement from food crops to cash crops, and also issues of ECA being relaxed and leading to not that kind of assured low price food provisioning for a lot of poor and relatively poor households. So I just leave it to any one of you to attend to this. We can take one or two people commenting on this, but this is important, both in terms of farmer incomes, diversification, especially for regions like Green Revolution, where people are saying that why are you doing only these two crops, low value crops, why not move to high value crops? Shiraz Hussain keeps writing about it, and government also thinks that we need to move out. We are a food surplus nation now. We need to move towards more income generating occupation crops. And the other side is that if we are making it so relaxed for people to stock food, it creates problems for people's food security. Siraj, you want to come in, or Sudha? Yeah.
I can start off the discussion. So, one of the things that we need to be clear about, at what level are we talking about diversification? I'm sure all of us know here that 2018-19, the horticulture production was 314 million tons and cereal food grains was 285. So, at the national level, we need to ask ourselves how much scope is this for diversification? And livestock, poultry, fisheries together is about 35.5% of gross value added. So how much diversification do we need to do further before we say that Indian agriculture is adequately diversified? And I think there may not be much room given the current income distributions, the current existing infrastructure, and the fact that water and soil are huge constraints. So I think at the national level, this question to me is how much diversification do we want before we say it's enough, and how much capacity do we have to diversify given all the existing constraints. That, of course, is not inconsistent with the idea that in specific areas you want diversification. You can go even further and say you want on-farm diversification for sustainability and resilience. And I think these three questions will all have very, very different answers. Regarding the capacity of agribusinesses to get into the space, I do believe whether it is horticulture or food grains, in one, the margins are very thin, and other spaces, the volatility is so high that contract enforcement and management become a problem. So it would really boil down to the relative strengths of different players on whether, for instance, FPOs maybe can succeed in very high value niche crops, but in terms of margins they make on food grain and non-perishables, it may not be very much. So I think it's a little bit of a crop specific, region specific question. But I certainly believe that because of the failure of public extension systems, engagement on farm through these players can have important productivity gains, and some of them have social enterprises are also including sustainability as a goal. And I think the verdict is not out yet, and we'll have to see what impacts it can have, positive impacts it can have.
Thank you. Sirajji, then I'll come to Vikas. Siraj is fine. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I think Punjab farmers realize that they cannot go on cultivating paddy forever. However, we know that the returns on paddy are much higher. So according to CACP report of 2017-18, paddy gave a return of some 43,000 rupees per hectare, while maize gave a negative return of 15,000 rupees. And sugarcane gave a return of 94,000 rupees per hectare. So the challenge before the government is how to compensate the farmers. I have been saying that there has to be a 10-year plan so that Punjab farmers can grow more pulses and oil seeds, more investment in research so that we can have better productivity of pulses. That will rejuvenate the soil, use less water. If it is coupled with direct investment, income support to farmers, I think many of them would be willing to diversify.
Okay. Thank you. Vikas?
Yeah, I actually say three things. One is that when one says diversification, is one merely talking about a diversification that is driven by market forces, or is one talking of a diversification that takes into account the ecological issues, ecological constraints that different regions have, nutritional requirements, and various other things, and therefore is a planned diversification in certain direction in different parts of the country. So that's, I think one needs to differentiate between these two scenarios. The second thing is that I think for any kind of diversification to happen, whether it's planned or merely market driven, a critical requirement is that the alternative crops that, as Mrs. Raju then pointed out, the alternative crops that you want farmers to grow have to become equally remunerative. If pulses are not going to be remunerative, you cannot expect farmers to grow pulses. If maize is not going to be remunerative in Punjab, you are not going to be able to make farmers in Punjab grow maize in place of paddy. So that's a critical requirement. You have to review this relative remunerativeness of crops, and how are you going to what is the way for the government to intervene in this, and what instruments does the government have? And I think this constant harking on deregulation of everything has harmed that cause. Government has lost the instruments that it had to intervene in relative remunerativeness of crops. And the only thing you're not with is MSP, and that's not an effective instrument because the only procurement you do is of wheat and rice. So you really are not able to use MSP to affect relative remunerativeness of crops.
Okay.
I think now, just 1 minute. When I say this, the last point I want to make is that this is critically contingent on relative remuneration that farmers get from production, and is not and direct income support. You cannot give them 20,000 rupees a year or 6,000 rupees a year and say now you shift to maize. Maize has to become more profitable if you want them to shift to maize.
Right.
Direct income support is not a substitute for this.
Right.
That's
Thank
the
you.
last
Thank
point.
you.
Thank you.
Dr. Vijay Lakshmi, any inputs on this?
Yeah. See, it is such an irony in our country that on the one hand, we are food surplus, we're producing so much, and on the other hand, you just see the malnutrition indicators, which has been released recently, NFHS 5 indicators. So there is, in certain states, even the stunting and wasting is still very, very high.
Yeah.
So the food reaching from the farm gate to the needy stomach is the entire pathway is very, very complicated. So it's an entirely different story altogether. So that is one issue one has to actually look into as a welfare state. That is one thing. The other thing about the farm diversity or diversification of crops, it is a complex issue, but can be done. It's a doable thing, provided we all have the willpower. Because the way in states, the way we plan and strategize each and every district, particular district will produce a particular crop if traditionally it is growing that particular crop. So the same way we can also organize. We also already have 11 zones, agroclimatic zones in the country. So according to that we can actually plan. All the agriculture scientists, administrators, state government, central government, all of them can put their heads together and plan in such a way that which crop has to be discouraged in which part of the country and which crop has to be promoted in which part of the country. This can be a regular exercise, annual exercise, and we can spend at least 10 days before the season begins. Put our heads together and then give in directions to the farmers. So this can be done. So what I want to say here is that irrespective of the MSP politics, one has to really look into these issues that the Punjab. In fact, we have discussed in ISB also about the Punjab issue, that the way the water table is going down in Punjab, and they are completely, the state government of Punjab is now thinking of completely banning rice and wheat. So there is this discussion is also going on there. But motivating the farmers, communicating it with the farmers is an art that one has to slowly do, and then convince them. So the one thing is that we have to actually, I'm just closing 1 minute. We have to actually encourage production of millets, encourage production of oil seeds and pulses, and horticulture crops, etc., and reduce a little bit of on the side of sugarcane. And I'm actually looking after sugarcane now. Just see, we are now this year we are surplus. But still, sugarcane is completely regulated sector. Now, you give export subsidies, which is against WTO, and then again, convince them, pray with them that, okay, for 2-3 years, we will be able to do this. And then what is going to happen to those export subsidies? It is not actually going back to the farmers. It will be somewhere in between in the value chain. So it's such a complicated scenario that, how do we actually reduce the production of food grains and increase the production of oil seeds and pulses and other hortic crops, and at the same time keeping the interest of the farmers in the center. So how do you actually provide good incomes to the farmers along with, the agri crops plus allied sector, fisheries, goatry and poultry, something
Thank
like
you.
that,
Thank you.
and with horticulture. So this way, I think we can really plan it well, and we can do it. We can do it provided we have the willpower.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, since I have a few minutes, I thank you very much for your very valuable and differential contributions, each one bringing a different perspective. The only thing I would like to add now here, since we are discussing this 3 or 2.5 acts, especially the new ones, the two, I somehow feel that if the regulation itself is faulty, how can it deliver goods? So that is my kind of stance on this. And I'll just highlight 2 or 3 things in the very acts itself, which are so problematic that you can't expect them to do certain things which you're expecting, whether bringing private investment to agriculture or giving better prices to farmers. For example, the APMC Mandi Bypass Act says that anyone with a PAN card can become a wholesale trader. Now, do we want to make our farmers deal with, I call it in my language, every Tom, Dick and Harry going and dealing with farmer produce, who has produced it over 6 months of hard labor? I think that is not the way to open up markets. So that is one part I would say, which is problematic. Second, I'm happy that Dr. Vijay Lakshmi talked so much about FPOs, but the treatment given to FPO is so shoddy. They are just clubbed with the farmer as if they're supplying side. We all know FPOs are doing contract farming. They are buying, they are processing, they are retailing, they are exporting. And you say FPO is only farmer, one type of farmer as a group. You are promoting FPOs, giving them such a prominent role for improving small farmer incomes and livelihoods. And here you just make them supplying entities, not even buying entities in any significant way. So I think that is also very problematic for me to accept. Then the way I think some of the concepts and terms have been defined, it is shocking. For example, the Contract Farming Act is so vague. People are confusing it with corporate farming. Because the way production agreement is defined, it gives you this leads that it is about maybe land leasing. Though the act clearly says the sponsor or contracting agency cannot transfer, lease, mortgage, or sell a farmer's land, that the contract is for the crop, not for the land. But when it says that if the farmer provides any service, company will pay the farmer, what does it mean? Generally, companies supply services, farmers pay for services. Here, I tell you the irony of things. It is so badly done that one state government, which was trying to create an alternative by amending these acts, ended up accepting this, that yes, companies will farm on farmers' lands and they have to take back their workers after the contract is over. They have gone ahead and put in on paper in their amended bill, which is still not approved. So how can you go ahead with this kind of faulty design when you don't even understand what you're talking about? That can create a lot of problems. That's why farmers are also not sort of convinced that this is only about crop contracting. It is not about anything else. The third part I want to highlight before I stop is that, for example, you keep saying that APMC mandis were not discovering prices efficiently. But in the Contract Act, you say, okay, after the pre-agreed minimum price, whatever price, any bonus or premium you want to pay, you have to benchmark it against APMC mandi price or e-trading market price. Why do you go back to that? Contract farming should discover its own prices. The buyer and the farmer, contracting agency and the farmer should discover their own price. And it not be only price. It could be about new technology, new crop, lower input costs, better quality produce. It could be anything. Why only price? So we have gone back to the APMC mandi to even help people discover contract prices. It speaks very poorly of the act. One more negative thing from the guidelines, Contract Farming Act guidelines, it says sharecropper can be a party to contract. And it says if the sharecropper is a party to contract, if he has to receive the inputs and make sure inputs are used well. So far, we had only known that contracting is done with landowner because it's about land. how can sharecropper be party to contract? Earlier, we had a bad law in Gujarat where they said APMC will be party to the contract agreement between farmer and the company. So I argued against that, then they made it optional. So why should we bring somebody else other than the two major parties, which is the producer and the buyer or sponsor, in a contract arrangement? It's a pure business arrangement between two entities. So that kind of lack of understanding creates a lot of issues. The last point I want to make about this act is, see, we had 2003 APMC Act, which had clearly specified mandatory aspects of a contract, what should go in a contract as a minimum set of clauses. They had even given a model contract farming agreement in 2003 Model Act, which all the states had adopted. Now you have no such thing. It's open to the two parties to decide on everything and anything. And it also talks more about very rudimentary things, very sophisticated aspects of contract farming, like contract cancellation clause. Who will bear the damage? It's not even mentioned there. Delayed deliveries at the factory gate for perishable produce, not even mentioned there. Tournaments in contract farming. Sudha can appreciate that, which is happening in many countries, making farmers compete with each other. Not even mentioned. Ultimately, the acts themselves are titled now Promotion and Facilitation Acts, not regulation anymore. So we have moved on. We have moved on from regulation, which I still feel is very important to protect the small farmer interest in a country like India in such commercial arrangements. Now we are talking about promoting and facilitating corporate entry through these acts rather than protecting the farmer interest adequately. Thank you very much. I thought this is important to bring some of these specific insights into the thing so that the audience and the participants can also ask specific questions. Okay, there is a question from Mr. Aditya Dhar. He's wondering about the distributional consequences of the reforms, whether they are so bad or not so positive. Then why are we not seeing protests in other states other than a few North Indian states? Maybe Vikas, you would like to take up this question?
I think there are 2 points one needs to understand. One is the protests are happening in Delhi and people from Tamil Nadu or Karnataka or something, they cannot reach Delhi. So to say that why farmers from Punjab and Haryana and UP are protesting in Delhi, one must keep that in mind. Because of the constraints that there are right now, farmers from other states cannot reach Delhi. So, the fact that, so we don't know. And there have been local protests in many other states. So it's not that the farmers in other states have no problem with it. The second thing is that it is also clear that these are states where public procurement is greater, and therefore there is more to lose. I mean, if public procurement, as is feared, that public procurement may be weakened. These are the states where that fear is clearly greater because public procurement is more important in these states. But I think it's also what Mr. Siraj Hussain said initially, that the prospect of big agribusiness investing is greater in these states, because markets of these states are more attractive to them. So, if the changes are likely to happen more in these states also. So all these three things are playing a role in the final form of protests that you are seeing.
Okay, thank you. Sudha, there is a question for you, which is by Amik Singh. He asks whether these farm laws will affect non-farm growth in a positive way. Therefore, they can absorb the labor released from the agriculture sector into higher value-adding activities, which would be more profitable.
Yeah, I think a lot depends on what kind of agribusinesses get into the space. Today, you see a lot of small agtech companies, even though their tech is supposed to be the strength, it's not as if they can take technology without people. So people have to deliver the technology, and in a way, I think to the extent that they are investing in storage and maybe some cleaning, assaying, and it has scope to expand some employment. I don't think, I don't know if it's going to be like that large. But on the other hand, if you look at big agribusinesses, and a good example is the Adani grain storage, and many of the farmers who are protesting actually talk about how it's so highly mechanized and using forklifts, and so there are very highly mechanized way of moving produce and doing logistics. There you're not going to see much. There's going to be a lot of automation in cleaning, grading, and you're not going to see much employment generation. So I think a lot depends on the kind of agribusinesses that get in, and the kind of sectoral differences will also matter. Some things can be mechanized and automated, others cannot.
Okay, thank you. Sirajji, there is a question for you, which is that which is by Aditya Das again, saying that if the farmers agree to the new proposed amendment that allows the states to charge taxes and levies in the new trade area, would not it lead to a race to the bottom across states, and we would end up again in a similar kind of situation?
I think different states had different levels of taxation, not only on agriculture, but even on other commodities before the GST came. And then all the taxes became equal for non-agricultural products. It was only in agriculture that Punjab taxes were very high, UP taxes were low, etc. So if the states decide to impose similar level of taxes in the trade area as they have in APMCs, then obviously there will be a tax disadvantage. But I must say that taxation is not the only thing which determines investment in a state. As I said in the beginning, there are a whole lot of other factors.
Right.
Proximity to markets, availability of infrastructure, supply of electricity, gundagardi in a state, the cess charged by our netas and officers. So all these factors also matter.
Okay, thank you. Sudha, there is a question which partially I had attempted, but this Dr. I think Aditya Das is asking, can you highlight major differences between the Model APMC Act, whether 2003 or 2017, and the new APMC Mandi Bypass Act?
I think this is a tough one.
Why?
Yeah, I think fundamentally, what I don't want to go into the details in the interest of time, but what the Model Acts were trying to do is to accommodate specific aspects of deregulation, like unified license, allowing contract farming. But the fundamental thing is, while allowing private participations piece by piece, under the umbrella of APMC, the bypass essentially rips it all out and says anything can happen outside. So I would say that's the crucial difference. And indeed, there is one perspective that you can take of this reform, that it's actually been anti-reform, because in a way, Mandis, states like Karnataka that had invested 12 years in actually reforming their state act, suddenly find that if they'd done nothing, they would still be in the same place more or less as others. I mean, I'm kind of, this is not quite an accurate version, but what I mean to say is the APMC bypass essentially sidesteps all the effort that different states have done and sort of takes a separate track without learning from what those who have implemented reforms based on the Model Acts, what was their learning and what were the pitfalls and challenges. And we've missed out on all of that learning by bypassing this entire act. So, but I know Aditya, so we can take the conversation outside.
Okay. Now there's another very interesting question which I would like Siraj and Vijay Lakshmi both to answer. First, Siraj Hussain. First question is written for you specifically, saying farmers are not getting decent price for their produce in Bihar. What policy level decision can be taken in this regard? Siraj Hussain first, then Vijay Lakshmi.
It is a very counterintuitive question, because the only solution one can suggest is to strengthen the APMCs, strengthen the marketing infrastructure, so that there are more buyers than the sellers in an organized manner. But other than that, we have seen that how the maize farmers in Bihar are exploited by traders from across India. And maize farmers receive just about 45 to 50% of the MSP.
Okay. Vijay Lakshmi? Anything to
There were
add?
certain intervention. Yeah, there were certain interventions, made by the government also, because the main reason for this is, not having post-harvest facilities. Immediately after harvest, agri produce would fetch you very, very less amount of money because of various factors. But if you can, keep it, store it for some more time, and then sell it slowly, the way traders do, farmers also can fetch good prices. So for that, especially for potatoes and for onions, and also some for some vegetable crops, the government could provide some subsidies for the farmers, and also for very small time kind of entrepreneurs, agri entrepreneurs, to invest and build up these facilities. So that is
Let me ask you that I'm sure you have studied the Kerala model of fruits and vegetables. Is that the way to go? Kerala has recently come out with a policy of MSP for fruits and vegetables. Is that the way to go to protect farmer interest in a state like Bihar?
yeah, why not? Why not, instead of having MSP only for food grain? I won't call it as minimum support price, but we can say that, for example, tomatoes. We all cite this example that tomatoes, when they are in season, they sell it for 50 paisa a kg, and when they are not in season, like monsoon season, July and August, they sell for 50 rupees a kg. So why don't we have a kind of an MRP kind of a thing, which we have for medicines, or so you can say that, even in season, tomatoes should sell at rupees at least 10 a kg or 15 rupees a kg. So that is the way I think we should go forward for at least, for perishable commodities like fruits and vegetables. I think
Okay,
that is
thank you.
the way.
There's another question from the Q&A box. One is that Indian agriculture doesn't operate in a vacuum. So what do we learn from the advanced economies to chart out a trajectory for India? Because doing nothing is no option. So Sirajji, would you like to? Or Vikas, yeah?
Yes, only yesterday I have read a report in The Nation.
Yeah.
Corporatization has sort of destroyed the rural communities in the US, because then the corporates do everything from seed supply to mechanization to harvesting, etc. And we have such a huge population dependent on agriculture. So, India has to develop its own unique model which can continue to provide employment to people, and it can't be whole, very large scale mechanization and large scale corporatization. So I think people like Dr. Sukhpal Singh and others have to about it, what is a more suitable model for India, and not go in for models which are followed in developed countries.
Vikas, any thoughts on that? What do we learn from there? Because doing nothing is not a solution.
Well, I don't think it's a question of doing nothing. But that's true. But that said, it's as I think. I mean, it is not the case that penetration of agribusiness corporates in other countries have not had problems, and what the one is fearing in India has also been seen elsewhere, and therefore, I mean, it does have resonance with what has happened elsewhere. The point is that, in fact, the second thing is that I also think that world over, the need for public investment, states to state intervention in agriculture in different forms has been historically important. It is important in less developed countries today. It has been important historically in countries that are developed today. So the need for state to actively intervene, both in the form of making investment, well, in the form of making investment, in regulating agriculture, and in providing support to farmers, is something in which there are any number of experiences from the world, and I think we should learn from those experiences. And at the same time, we must keep an eye on our own unique constraints, our own unique strengths and issues, and identify what is the right way of going about it. And it certainly, whatever is the right way, can only come through a process of consultations. It has to be a consultative process of figuring out what is the best way of moving forward. It cannot be rammed through. It has to be a process where all stakeholders and most of all farmers are consulted. It cannot be a process where laws such as these are rammed through.
Okay.
That
process is as important as the content. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Or the tool. Yeah. So anyway, now I think we have very apt question to at least end from my side. This is a question from an anonymous source. That itself is a good thing to. So the question is very important for all of us to apply our mind, and whoever would like to attend to it. The question is, why is there always an extreme situation when it comes to agriculture? Large employment sector, lowest contribution to GDP, and now many farmers on the borders of Delhi struggling to claim their right in agriculture. Where are we? So any thought, any reaction to that? But that is the live question, actually, like the live struggle going on. What is the kind of insights we can give on this? How do we answer this kind of thing? That why, when it comes to agriculture, why do we have this kind of extreme situations? When it comes to farmers, why do we treat farmers? We said putting the farmer first. And here question is, we are not putting the farmer first in this country. Yeah.
Actually, Dr. Sukhpal Singh, I have a slightly different take. In fact, farmers' issues come to the attention of media and the country from time to time. Similar issues are faced by several other groups of people, for example, artisans, but they are never by the media. So, for example, during the pandemic, my own sense is that artisans and small, businessmen, small, people who do repair jobs and all that, they have suffered more than farmers.
Right.
That is not covered by media.
They are not organized also at all. Yeah. In fact, let me just add, it's very interesting. Today, one TV channel is showing already a farmer survey asking farmers what do they think of different aspects of these acts. I was surprised. They have done it across 20 states. They are showing with the help of prominent graphs and whatnot. So any other thoughts, Sudha, Vikas, or Vijay Lakshmi on this? How do we treat farmers in terms of policy and Vijay Lakshmi? No? Vikas? Sudha?
I just want to say one thing. I think after 30 years of what I would call failed attempts at liberalizing agriculture, we are in a situation when there are deep structural defects in the agrarian economy of India, and it's really calling for a very, very serious rethink on how India's agricultural economy needs to be regulated and managed. I mean, there are the both ecological, economic, social, the fault lines are really deep now, and this just requires a very serious, comprehensive look at what is ailing agriculture. So it's not merely a question of these laws. It's not merely a question of tinkering one thing or the other. We need a very, very comprehensive review of what's happening to agriculture. That's what I'd say.
My view is that we keep thinking of, as economists, we keep thinking of trajectories of development. And in many ways, India is bucking the trend. In fact, African countries are looking to India to learn from us because they don't see themselves go the way the developed countries evolved. And I mean that in two specific senses. One is this whole transition that get people out of agriculture so that they can work in the non-farm sector. In a globalized environment, that is not, it's not very clear that it can happen in the same ways that happened historically in other developed countries. And in some sense, the precarious nature of employment in the non-farm sector is also why people are hesitant to exit agriculture, because agriculture is your fallback option. And we saw that very well in COVID. So the kind of policies that we keep thinking we should make farmers exit and create opportunities there, in an age of flexible employment, precarious employment, that strategy is going to have, it's going to get a few 100,000 out, but not in the, on the scale we imagine. Rather, let's put it the other way around and imagine farming as a space where livelihoods are created, evolved. Associated with that is the kind of dignity of labor, because of caste issues and this stigma associated with manual labor. Farming is no longer cool. And so, I mean, when Mahendra Singh Dhoni was actually running a tractor in farm during COVID, he kept coming in the news. And I was saying, how many people run tractors? But, you know, there is this kind of, now when elite people, software engineers give up and do farming, there is this idea of sense of cool. But the farmers don't associate it with any coolness. It's more like youth want to exit agriculture. So I think in our minds as policymakers, we need to think of agriculture differently, irrespective of, I mean, I think that's the first step we need to take, that unless we think of agriculture as not as a sunset sector, but as one that can usefully employ people with dignity of labor. And in my work on youth in agriculture, I've really discovered that given a chance, young people would love to do farming and feel good about and proud about it. It's just that, and they don't appreciate city life where they are treated quite badly and the working conditions are quite poor. And how can we tap into this kind of optimism and energy that's there and provide facilitative environment and investments to make that a sustainable opportunity? So I would think of agriculture first as one way and as a positive sector that can actually retain employment.
Okay, thank you. Vijayalakshmi?
Yeah, I would like to close by saying that, as I said earlier, it is a very, very complex, sector. But at the same time, we have to see agriculture as a sustainable, kind of livelihood opportunity only when we include the allied sector opportunities also. For example, fisheries, poultry, goatry, etc., etc. Because I worked as animal husbandry, dairy, and fisheries secretary for 4 years. So during that experience, I saw many youth who were actually, well placed in other countries, coming back and doing fishery here, doing goatry here, and setting up poultry farms, etc. So that like youth are actually getting attracted to this allied sector. So we should not, when we talk about agriculture, we should not only talk about tilling the land, putting some seed and growing food grain. It is not going to be a sustainable model. We have to include, one, if in a household of 4 or 5 people, if one person is concentrating on food grain production, the other should focus on some allied activity, and the third one should actually take up some skill related activity and do some service sector activity. So if you actually do like this, then it will be a very good model of providing sustainable incomes in the rural areas. So then you have a lot of fallback options.
Yeah, we call
you will
them
not actually get it.
Time. I would like to thank all of you for giving your best and sort of going by my sort of request and kind of questions, whatever I could frame for you. So I hope you enjoyed. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you and interacting with you. I would like to thank Dr. Prabhat Ghosh, the director of ADRI, and Kumar Das for giving me this opportunity to work with all of you and see you after a while, some of you at least. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. I hand it over to you. And I thank all the participants for their active participation, asking very intelligent questions. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to thank all of you, Dr. Sukhpal Singh, Dr. N. Vijayalakshmi, Dr. Siraj Hussain, Dr. Sudha Narayan, and Dr. Vikas Rawat. I have nothing to add to the discussion that we had, except for the one point. In Bihar, all these agricultural years came up sometime in early 70s with a specific grant from the World Bank. As a young economist, I was given the responsibility of evaluating 3 market years, the impact of the market years on the marketing process. I do remember during those days what tremendous impact these market years had made towards improving the marketing of the Mexico products in Bihar. Along with the market years also came the APMC Act and the APMC committees. Okay, as it normally happens, if there is an institution which is very effective, a vested interest grows around it to capture it. Okay, that happens everywhere, and APMC was no exception to that. My own impression is that in 2006, when the APMC was abolished in there, I don't think Act was abolished. What was abolished were those committees, okay, for each of the marketing committees. And my own impression is that it was abolished because the political profile of those people who were controlling market years was very different from the people who had come recently to power. In 2005, 2005 we had a new election, the previous regime was concluded, etc. So, main institution, one thing that I want to make a point is that I agree that presently the APMCs do not act. There are lots of problems, there are lots of suboptimalities and vested interest and inefficiency, so on and so on and so forth. But we must remember that when an institution does not function, you cannot solve the problem by making another institution. The kind of problem that infected the institution earlier, APMC have acted very well in the 70s and 80s. I know for mine in Bihar. Okay, the forces which has gradually corrupted the APMC will also gradually corrupt the new institution. So what has to do is to reform the APMC, not a final alternative, which, as many of you pointed, and I also read some of the articles, lack of security for many of the farmers.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. Lack of security for many of the farmers. Okay, so if I have to make a suggestion to all those people who are thinking about these laws, that there is no need to replace the APMCs, but we could certainly have new laws, new formulations and regulations which make APMC work. That's the simple, small thing. I am not an expert on that.
No, very good suggestion. Yeah. There's no escape from reforming APMCs. I believe, strongly believe in that. They are the last resort for the small and marginal farmers. Yeah.
If an institution does not function, you cannot solve the problem by creating another institution. You can be pretty sure the forces that corrupted the first institution will also gradually corrupt the second institution. So those negative forces have to be controlled, not the change of the institution. Okay,
right.
This is a small point that I had. Thank you very much, all of you. I am sure Kumar will have more such topics where we will be benefited from your contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.